Hello, and today we're going to be focusing on the effects of this integration of the Western and Eastern Hemisphere between 1450 and 1750. So, if you've been following the lectures, we started off with Unit 4 looking at the causes and motivations of exploration and kind of the beginnings of the spreads of exploration or maritime reconnaissance. And then we took a look at this concept of the Columbian Exchange, which starts to segue us into the effects of this interaction between the Western and the Eastern Hemisphere. So, in a lot of ways, the rest of Unit 4 is looking at the consequences of this connectivity. And what we're going to focus on in this lecture is the consequences that deal with religion. So, this would be a form of cultural exchange. We're going to focus particularly on the spread of Christianity. So the basic overview is pretty straightforward. One, this is a continuity of things we've already talked about in this course. This is a pattern that we've seen develop where you have interaction between societies, religion spread. Now, in this case, is going to be a very heavy one direction of spread, where Christianity is going to spread into the Americas, but also Christianity is going to be, I shouldn't say Christianity, I should say Roman Catholicism, and particularly West European Roman Catholicism, is going to be introduced in a way that it hasn't been introduced before to Eurasia. But we're really going to focus on the South Asian, East Asian regions, as well as Latin America. We're going to see a big difference, but recognize that this is part of a pattern. It's no different than the spread of Islam, it's no different than the spread of Buddhism. Is taking place along a new trade route that's developed. The European or the Catholic missionaries are the primary drivers, but it's still at its essence the same concept. So we want to talk about the state of Christianity in 1450. Christianity is not the dominant world religion at this point. The dominant world religion, the one that has its presence in a variety of places, is Islam. Islam is in West Africa, it's in the Middle East, it's in Southeast Asia, it's in South Asia. There's an Islamic presence within the Chinese population. Um, Islam is throughout Central Asia, along the East African states. Islam is more of a global phenomenon than Christianity at this point, because Christianity is largely kind of put into Europe. You have that West East split between the Roman Catholic and Orthodox. But soon after 1450, we have a further split between the Catholics and the Protestants. So when you look at 1450, and if you were to say that Western brand of Christianity, Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, will spread across the globe, in 1450, people would have laughed because Islam was really the religion that was spreading. And yet, we're going to watch over the next 500 years how Christianity goes from being largely this, I'm sorry, I should say Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, largely located in West Europe, how it becomes a global phenomenon. And it starts here with this time unit. So we have to talk about the impact of the Reformation. So with the Reformation, all you really need to understand right now is that there is a split between Catholic churches, Roman Catholic churches, and Protestant churches. And this split is going to redefine West Europe as it relates to religion. And the big thing to know is that out of this, we're going to have Catholic nations, Spain and Portugal and France. Now, without getting too much into the weeds here, Spain and Portugal are aggressively Catholic. They see it as their job to restore Catholicism as the primary religion, not just of West Europe, but also of the world. So you want to think of the missionary energy being located within Spain and Portugal. France is Catholic, but there are some differences. France has historically always been kind of independent of the Catholic Church, kind of doing their own thing. When I say independent of the Catholic Church, I mean independent of the Pope and of the institution. So while France is Catholic, and there are certainly going to be Catholic missionaries coming out of France, the strength of the missionaries are really coming from Spain and Portugal. The Protestant nations, the Netherlands and England, and remember that the Netherlands are also referred to as the Dutch, they are Protestant. They are not as energetic about spreading the faith. And what I want you to understand from letter C is that the Catholic nations, as they go out and they start to expand their reaches and their influence, Catholic missionaries are going to be very much part of that expansion. Whereas in the Protestant nations, certainly there will be some missionaries, but it is not a driving motive or a driving reason for expansion. The Dutch and the English at this point are really just interested in doing business. We're going to talk about why that matters later. Now, there's a lot of different missionary groups, but we want to focus on one in particular, letter D, the Jesuit missionaries. So the Jesuit missionaries are a result of what we call the Counter-Reformation. And the basic idea is that the Reformation splits Europe between Protestants and Catholics. The Counter-Reformation is an attempt by the Catholic Church to reassert itself amongst Europe, but also globally. So out of this Counter-Reformation comes a big idea that the Catholics should spread the religion everywhere. And a group is going to form called the Jesuits. And the Jesuits' job is to spread Catholicism, not just within West Europe, but throughout the globe. So there's a strong energy for evangelicalism, if you will. Evangelicalism, that's the word, sure. But there's a strong sense of the missionary effort in the Catholic movement rather than the Protestant movement in the 1500s. Now, when we get to the 1800s, that's going to flip, but that's not till later. And one of the strategies that the Jesuits are going to use is to convert the leaders of a society and then have the hopes that that becomes a trickle down conversion process. And that's something I just want you to keep in mind when you look at how the Jesuits approach things. They don't necessarily work from the ground up, they work from the top down. And we'll keep that in mind as we go along. So, what we're going to do, and you see a lot of information here, but it's actually very straightforward. The Spanish and the Portuguese begin to make their contacts with the Asian world through the Indian Ocean. So the Portuguese are going to be the primary drivers of this. Certainly the Spanish will get there, but the Portuguese are the big ones. So when we talk about all three of these areas, it's the Portuguese that we really want to focus on and remember. Because as the Portuguese come into the Indian Ocean, missionaries are coming along with them, Jesuit missionaries are coming along with them. And their job is to spread Catholicism to Asia. So the first stop of our little tour is going to be in the Mughal Empire of South Asia. And as you already may recall, the Mughal Empire was noted for its religious tolerance. So the arrival of Catholicism was greeted, with curiosity. Mughal rulers certainly connected with Catholic missionaries to learn more. But that idea that they must convert to one true faith was lost on the Mughal leadership because they were so embracing of different faiths. So that right there was an obstacle for Catholicism to grab on in South Asia, was the Mughal policy of religious tolerance wouldn't have allowed for the idea of one faith only that everyone must follow. And then the second thing is that as Catholicism starts to spread in, there's reaction within South Asia amongst the caste systems. So again, we come back to the caste systems, this hierarchy of society within South Asia. And at the top of this hierarchy are the Brahmins. One of the Jesuit missionaries, D. Nobili, said that the approach the Jesuits should take is to behave like the Brahmins, to dress like the Brahmins, to adopt Brahmin practices such as not eating meat, associating with the Brahmins in the hopes that converting the Brahmins over to Catholicism would trickle down to everybody else within society. Now, this is going to raise a bit of a dispute within the Jesuit order because some of the Jesuits feel like, what's actually happening is that the missionaries are being converted over to South Asian culture instead of bringing them into the Catholic faith. So eventually, Di Naboli's approach is going to be rejected. And the Brahmin caste is a very hard sell to convert them over to Christianity because what their religious system does is it justifies the caste system, which keeps the Brahmins at the top of the social order. The other thing is that in Christianity, the emphasis is on spiritual equality. All worshipers worship together, regardless of social status. The Brahmins had a strict code of not associating with lower caste. So, this South Asian caste system strictly enforced this kind of segregation of the classes. And Catholicism was seen as undermining that value. So, Catholicism doesn't grab on amongst the Brahmin class. Where it does grab on is amongst the lower caste. And we've seen this before. When Buddhism was initially introduced, the lower caste were the ones who converted. When Islam came in, the lower caste were the ones who initially converted. And when Catholicism shows up, any converts that they do achieve are more likely to come from the lower caste. But here's the key thing, and this is something to kind of tie all the Mughal Empire together. Catholicism doesn't run through South Asia and convert people in large numbers. There's a couple isolated groups that do convert. There's a couple communities that convert. For the most part, South Asia is still going to be predominantly Hinduism and Islam. And there might be a spattering of small communities of Christians. So the biggest thing is that Islam and Hinduism was already providing the structure for the Mughal Empire. Why would people need to convert to Christianity and to the spiritual equality concept of Christianity when they found the same spiritual equality within Islam? Why would they need to convert to Catholicism with all its rituals when Hinduism already provided those rituals? So we go now to Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. So if you remember, the Tokugawa shogunate was critical to centralizing authority under one individual, the shogun, and bringing Japan into a state of unification. So when the Jesuits show up and they begin converting Japanese people, Japanese peasants, to Christianity, the shogun sees a threat. The shogun sees a threat to the authority of the shogun because here's a religion that says the supreme power of the universe is God, even more powerful than the shogun. And for a shogun, for a family, the Tokugawa, who just spent considerable resources and blood unifying the state, Christianity threatened to undermine that unity. So when we talk about a reaction of the shogun to Christianity, the shogun sees Christianity as a threat, which brings us to the Shimabara rebellion. Now, this is getting a little bit more detailed than you probably need, but I think it's fascinating. There is a community, a Shimabara, which is comprised of peasants, former samurai, but also Japanese Christians. And they go into rebellion against the Tokugawa shogunate. And it takes months to put down this rebellion. In fact, this rebellion is the last battle of Japanese unification. And the shogun is going to brutally put down this rebellion. And this rebellion is prime evidence that Catholicism and Christianity was a threat to the Japanese authority or the threat to the Japanese order. So that brings me to number 3. What the Tokugawa shogunate does is issues in about 1634, 1635, a thing called the Sakaku Edict. And the Sakaku Edict basically tells Christian society, you're not welcome. It tells West Europeans, for the most part, we don't want you here. And a lot of people say the Sakaku Edict shuts Japan off from the world. And to a degree, they're right. It definitely shuts the Japanese off to Spain and Portugal. It is going to limit contact with other nations, the Japanese are still going to be involved in connection to China and to Korea. So it's not like they're completely isolated, but they definitely adopt a policy of turning within and very much limiting contact with the Portuguese, the Spanish, to the point of saying we don't want any contact. So the Sakaku Edict is a reaction to Christianity. And what we should say is in 1, 2, and 3, there's a common theme. Christianity is a threat, and Christianity will be outlawed within the Japanese society. So not only is it illegal for Jesuit missionaries to preach the word, but it's illegal for any Japanese citizen, for lack of a better word, to practice Christianity. And if you take a look at the picture on the right, you see a man standing in the middle with his foot on a piece of stone. And what he's doing is he's stepping on a image of Jesus, of the crucified Jesus. And the idea was to demonstrate the rejection of Christianity. So this is a man who is accused of having Christian sympathies, and he is publicly demanded to step on the crucified Jesus as a way of reaffirming his rejection of Christianity. And so with Japan, what you want to do is you want to see that they completely reject the presence of Christianity because they see in it a threat. The only exception to this anti European contact is the relationship with the Dutch. So the Japanese are going to permit trade with the Netherlands. And it's a long story about how we get there. But the Japanese basically will trade with the Dutch because the Dutch do not bring missionaries. So that goes back to that Protestant Catholic split. The Japanese said, we'll do business with the Dutch because they don't bring missionaries. They don't try and convert people. However, there's very strict limitations on this trade. For example, the Dutch can only trade within a small window during the calendar year, and then they can only trade at one port, the port of Nagasaki. And if you've heard of Nagasaki before, it's more likely it's in connection to World War II. But that relationship between the Japanese and the Dutch keeps the Japanese relatively in contact with Western developments. But for the most part, you can think of Japan as shutting its doors to the outside influences in the hopes of preserving the unity that the Tokugawa worked so hard to create. When we go to Ming China, um, the Jesuits, under the leadership of Matteo Ricci, decide to focus their efforts on the emperor. That's that top-down approach. And what Matteo wants to do is impress the emperor with his scientific knowledge, because at this time, West Europe is undergoing a scientific revolution. And what he wants to do is show the value of Western society and hope that the emperor will go, well, if Western society is so great, then their religion must be so great. And this is going to fail. So while the emperor certainly does, look at the calendars and look at the telescopes and the other inventions, such as the clock that's coming out of West Europe and adopts them, he is going to reject Christianity. Very few people within the court of the emperor are going to convert over. Again, with China, there's a failure to convert over the leadership, but the lower class, there are going to be successes of converting different people where the Portuguese are going to show up and interact with more of the common people, peasants and merchants. That's where you're going to see it. But even then, those are much smaller numbers. And the other thing that Catholicism does is it creates the resentment of the Confucian scholars, because the Confucian scholars are the ones who are prized for their intellect. They're the prized, learned community. Now here comes this outside group presenting ideas that challenge the Confucian scholars' primacy. And what the Confucian scholars are going to do is emphasize a anti-Catholic or an anti-Christian ideal. And what I mean by that is that while they don't go to the extreme of Japan, China, for the most part, is going to restrict access from the Portuguese and other foreign European nations. And when we look at the basic generalization for the Asian empires, The three big things I want you to understand. One, Catholicism or Christianity in general is not going to successfully take over these three areas because those three areas already have established traditions and extremely strong states. So the missionaries are kind of at the will or at the mercy of these three governments. The governments will tell the missionaries to do whatever they want. There's not a lot the missionaries or their respective countries could do to stop it. So, one, the spread of Christianity into these three areas is limited because of the strength of the existing states. Two, whatever converts are found are usually coming from the lower class segments of society. And then the third one is that this primary contact is Catholic in nature. So the Mughal Empire, there will be converts and they'll convert over to Catholicism. In Japan, there will be converts. They're going to be kind of considered an underground society, and they're Catholic. And in Ming China, there will be converts, and again, they're much fewer and they're much sparser, and they will be Catholics as well. But the general idea that Catholicism just overruns these three areas is simply incorrect. Now, one area where Catholicism did overrun was the Philippines. So the Philippines is going to come under control of the Spanish. And when the Spanish take over the Philippines, there is no strong central government. Um, the Spanish demonstrate their power, which the indigenous people of the Philippines associate with strength. And so the leaders are going to start converting over to Catholicism, which means the people will convert over to Catholicism. And in the Philippines, this looks more like a conquest of Catholicism. However, and this is going to become a pattern, is that even though Catholicism is being introduced in the Philippines, traditional practices are still going to continue. And this is another theme that continues on, such as what we call ancestor veneration. So, for example, worshiping of ancestors of the deceased is very common, not just in the Philippines, but throughout world culture. And there was a practice of sharing a meal with the dead spirits of your ancestors. And this practice is going to continue on. The Catholic practice of counting or praying over the rosary is going to be combined with this kind of communion with the dead ancestors. Another thing was public bathing, which is something that happened a great deal within the Philippines before the Catholic missionaries showed up. Catholic missionaries um, rejected public bathing because it was a sign of immodesty. However, the Filipinos will continue to do it. So this is going to be something that we're going to see next slide. It's a very common thing is that, yes, a new religion might come into the Philippines, but traditional practices are going to continue on, sometimes adopting to Catholic practices, and other times just outright defying Catholic practices. So, where we really see that concept is in Latin America. So, as the Spanish come in, so most of what I've talked about up to this point, South Asia, Ming China, and Tokugawa Japan, has been the Portuguese. The Philippines have been the Spanish. Now we come to Latin America, and most of this is going to be the Spanish, with the exception of Brazil, of course, which is going to be Portuguese. Now, what happens through a variety of things is that the Spanish end up conquering a lot of the region. And they do this because of the military advantage they have with gunpowder. Now, diseases are going to play a big role in disrupting the existing states that are already there. But that military advantage kind of allows the Spanish to impose their will on the Native Americans. And yet, the imposition of Catholicism onto the Native Americans is going to be met with conflict with the local traditions. In other words, the Native Americans don't just give up their local traditions. They're going to continue to practice them, in some ways blending them with Catholic practices, and in other ways just outright rejecting them. So sometimes this conflict spilled over to where the Spanish would destroy idols and shrines. So this was a very common practice where the Spanish are destroying the religion of the Native Americans. That's one example of this type of conflict. The second is the resistance from the Native Americans. So a couple of different things could happen. For example, Native Americans could accept the baptism and then quietly continue to do their traditional rituals and rites and celebrations. So, in other words, they may act Catholic when the Spanish are around, but when Spanish eyes are not watching, the Native Americans just go right back to what they've always done. And this is a very common thing. This isn't just unique to Latin America. Okay. A second form of resistance from the Native Americans is you could see it in the form of what we call syncretism. And we'll talk about that, where they preserve traditional practices within the practices and rituals of Catholicism. So one way is kind of just go in front of the Spanish, yep, we're Catholic, and then go off and do what you always wanted to do when the Spanish aren't looking. And another way is to bring in their practices into Catholic rituals and ceremonies. And that's a way that the Native Americans were able to preserve and continue their practices. The letter C, the establishments of churches, is something important in the sense that churches are going to be built on those Native American religious sites. So as churches get built throughout the New World or throughout Latin America, it's going to be Native Americans who are doing the actual physical labor. And where it's going to be built is right on top of where the Native Americans used to practice their religious practices. So you have this, I mean, it's a great metaphor for kind of the Spanish domination of religion on the Native Americans. But then we come down to probably the most important thing out of all of this, syncretism. So if you remember, syncretism is when I take two opposing concepts, or I take two concepts and I combine them together to produce something new. Now, in this case, not only do you have the European and Native Americans, but you also have Africans who are coming over by virtue of the transatlantic slave trade. So now you have enslaved Africans, you have Native Americans, and you have the colonial Europeans. And we have three different systems of faith that are interactive. So we're going to get new types of faith, if you will, new versions of faith, such as Vodun or Vodun, which is more known as voodoo. So Vodun is going to show up in different forms. But basically, what Vodun does is it takes traditional African beliefs, beliefs and spirits of nature that kind of come out of West Africa and that animistic tradition that we've talked about before. So we know that West Africa had Islam, but we also know that it had a continuity of traditional practices, traditional worship of spirits. And those traditional practices are going to come into the Americas. And as the enslaved Africans are converted over to Catholicism, they're going to combine elements of Catholicism, particularly the idea of the saints, and fuse that with their animistic religions that they've brought over with them. And that comes out into the form of a religion we call Vodun, or more commonly known as voodoo. Santiara is another example of a syncretic religion, again, combining elements of African society with elements of Catholicism and combining them into a form of religion called Santiara that preserves elements of African tradition. The Day of the Dead. You may know the celebration of the Day of the Dead of this kind of Mexican tradition, but the Day of the Dead dates back to an Aztec tradition. And when the Day of the Dead is going to be combined with the celebration of what we call All Saints Day, we get a new type of holiday, a new type of ritual. And the celebrations of the Day of the Dead that continue on, so accurately depicted within Coco, the Day of the Dead is a Native American tradition that is going to borrow from Catholicism and is going to continue on. And then lastly, Our Lady of Guadalupe. So there is a reporting of seeing the Virgin Mary in 1531 within Mexico. And there's 5 sightings, and you can see the painting on the right where, the Madonna, the Virgin Mary, um, appears to Native Americans, and you see it's the same one, and she is appearing. So what happens is a church gets built, and she becomes associated or called Our Lady of Guadalupe. And the church where this happens, where this is built, this is one of the most visited sites within Mexico. It's part of the Mexican national heritage. But the Virgin Mary is going to be also associated and sometimes called Tonantzin. I probably butchered that name, but Tonantzin, Tonantzin? We'll go with Tonantzin. Tonantzin is like a mother goddess to the Aztecs. And this idea that a mother goddess is going to be associated with the Virgin Mary just reinforces this idea of syncretism, where Native American beliefs are going to persist and combine with Catholic beliefs to produce something new. So that is basically the lecture. I'm going to sum it up because I think it is important to sum up. As the Spanish and the Portuguese, and that's who we've really been focusing on, as they've spread throughout the globe, the Portuguese are going to really be the big actors in Asia. Portuguese are going to try and take Catholicism to South Asia, the Mughal Empire, to Japan with the Tokugawa shogunate, and to China with the Ming Dynasty. And in all 3 cases, Catholicism will have an extremely limited impact on those 3 societies. Mughal Empire kind of just shrugs its shoulders and, it acknowledges Catholicism, but otherwise doesn't really care. China is going to talk with the missionaries, but for the most part, limit their contact with the foreigners. And then Tokugawa's Japan is going to just exile any of the missionaries, outlaw Christianity, and shut its doors off to Spain and Portugal. The Spanish come into the Philippines and Latin America and are able to impose Catholicism on those 2 populations. However, those native populations are going to persist at maintaining local traditions. And we're going to see new forms of Catholicism or Christianity or of religion develop. And then in Latin America, you also have to throw in the enslaved African population, which brings their beliefs. And we see a syncretism that develops out of combining with Catholicism. So that right there takes care of the spread of religion during the 1450 to 1750. And with that, please bring any questions to class, and I'll see you next time. Bye.